if I could have Tess?
Absolutely not.
I would love to.
That would be beautiful.
Tess.
Just one dance.
Are you kidding me?
This means so much to me. You have no idea.
I'm glad I could help you fill your void.
Written and directed by Thomas J. Churchill, we are talking Night Carnage. And no, that is not a reference to my wild nights out when I was younger. This is actually a low-budget vampire versus werewolf dating horror movie. Yes, sound interesting? Okay, so Night Carnage, what is the story? It focuses on three parties, you might say. We've got a vampire who is the kind of, aristocratic, upper class vampire who is going on dates, trying to find his, a kind of reincarnation of his lost love, and killing the dates basically afterwards when they don't measure up, I suppose. We've got a female werewolf who does a kind of dating blog type thing, and she basically goes on dates and blogs all about it. But if the guys are assholes, she'll turn into a werewolf and eat them. And then we have a third party where a descendant of Van Helsing is in charge of a kind of vampire hunting community, and he is trying to hunt down vampires, obviously, in particular the vampire that was responsible for killing a descendant of his. It happens to be this kind of our main vampire, so to speak. And they're the kind of the three parties, and the bulk of the movie is set up, if I'm honest. It's these two, the vampire and the werewolf going on a couple of different dates, and inevitably these three parties kind of meeting for the first time towards the end of the movie. And what will happen, you'll have to watch the movie to find out. So, Night Carnage, let's talk about it. What can we say that works? So we've seen movies that have a type of social commentary in, I think, many times before. But a horror movie that is commenting on dating, that's somewhat unique, I would say. And the fact that this werewolf character, this female werewolf character, does a dating blog, it gives the opportunity to talk about modern dating, I suppose, and the pitfalls of it, particularly from that kind of female perspective. Bear in mind this is written by a guy, however. Anyway, so, I think it's a relatively interesting kind of idea where, some people don't like this kind of commentary, I suppose, in movies, but it's not political commentary. This is kind of social commentary, I suppose. And, I've got to say, I think it's an interesting kind of idea. With some kind of stereotypes kind of thrown out there nonetheless, but I think it still has some sort of interesting things maybe that it wants to say. And I think the metaphor here for, dating different types of people, a vampire and a werewolf, one might say, could be seen as, an interesting idea, I guess. So I do think the movie has somewhat of an interesting sort of premise. Another kind of sort of side of the movie which I also found interesting, there's no true protagonist in this film, or really antagonist, because it sort of frames all three parties as both protagonist and antagonist. Now, I'm not sure if this was necessarily intentional, because the movie doesn't seem particularly deep, but by all accounts, our vampire character, he's looking for love, he's looking for that connection. The dates that this kind of werewolf go on, all the ones we see are kind of a-holes of one description or another, so it's sort of justifying the reason why she's killing him, and she wants to meet Mr. Right. And our kind of vampire killers are, you know, they are portrayed necessarily about being the good guys, but in kind of towards the end, our main vampire hunter is on a date with the werewolf woman, not knowing she's a werewolf, and you know he gets jilted when this kind of vampire basically swoops in and kind of steals his girl. So you kind of think, is he just being kind of jealous and petty about it? So you really have a situation where all three of these kind of parties, you could argue, have elements of being an antagonist. The werewolf and vampire both kill people, and you could say the vampire hunters are the good guys. But you know, is this guy acting through altruistic motives, or is he just kind of like butthurt because he got jilted? Now, I'm not really sure what the intent was. And you could argue on the negative, perhaps, that there's no true protagonist here to follow. And as such, you fail to connect to maybe any of these groups because they all have elements of each. But at the same time, you know, you have people that are shades of grey, or characters that are shades of grey, at least to a degree. And I think the movie is trying to paint certainly our supernatural characters as certainly killers, but they're trying to justify maybe why they are doing it. Like the vampire can't help himself, for example, and the werewolf is killing a-holes. Anyway, so there's some sort of interesting commentary, I suppose. The movie is low budget. It is cheap. I think the werewolf costume is actually quite good. I don't think it's lit very well, and I think it's sometimes overlit, and you can see the flaws, and you can kind of see it looks like a costume. I think had it been lit a little better, a little bit more kind of like in the shadow, kept in shade, or just had a little bit more better cinematography in it, I think the werewolf costume as it is would have looked better. I think it shows the flaws, but I actually gotta say, for a kind of a low budget movie, this is a full-on hulking kind of werewolf costume that, although yes it has flaws, I still kind of liked it. I am used to watching B movies, but I still kind of quite appreciated the actual design and stuff like that, so that was quite good. Let's talk about some of the acting here. Now, I do think some of the acting is actually fairly solid. Our werewolf character, this woman who has this sort of dating blog, she has this cousin that she often interacts with who knows that she is a werewolf but isn't actually a werewolf herself. And they actually kind of look similar, so they look like they're related, I've got to say. I don't know if they are in real life, but their interactions I just thought were very naturalistic, and they seemed like genuine sort of conversations that family members might have, and I thought they were actually quite good. And those sort of conversations with each other about the dating stuff, and then having to deal with the kind of the werewolf kind of curse, were interesting and actually sort of fairly strong. The acting is mixed. There's some negatives we'll come on to, but those sequences, I've got to say, were fairly good. And there's a smattering of other kind of like scenes with the acting I thought was actually okay. Sadie Katz is in this, you know, probably the best known actor here, and she has an interesting smaller role as a kind of a cop who has a unrequited love with the vampire hunting guy, and it's never really dwelled on, but you know, it's fine and stuff. So you know, it's kind of some decent sequences where I do think some of the dramatic elements kind of work. We do get a kind of three-way fight towards the end. It's short, but I still kind of quite liked it, and I thought it was relatively kind of well staged. Okay, so Night Carnage, the negatives. Let's discuss. So this is a lot of a phrase that I have used many times on doing this channel: conversations in rooms. There's a lot of it. I would say the main issue with this movie is that it runs about an hour and 30 minutes, 90 minutes. 70 minutes of this is conversations in rooms of one description or another, without really any forward momentum in the plot. We go on 2 dates, each with the werewolf and the vampire, before we get to our meeting of all 3 parties, which happens around the 70-minute mark. So we spend quite a lot of time with these people going on various dates. And then the vampire hunting team just kind of talking about vampire hunting stuff in the bar. And then we have the discussion about the dates with the werewolf woman and a cousin, things like that. There is a lot of dialogue in this movie, but without really forwarding the plot, I have to say. It is just sort of, I guess you might say character building stuff, and I'd certainly say that you needed some of that, but I don't know if you needed like 2 dates, for example, for each of the werewolf and the vampire to really establish what the movie is trying to do. You maybe had to go with 1 day each, perhaps. But this is the movie that it wants to be, clearly. It seems more interested in a discussion about dating than actually a story about werewolves, vampires, and supernatural hunters. So the movie doesn't really have a huge amount of forward momentum in actual kind of plot. And I would say our vampire hunting group gets sort of sidelined for a lot of this. And they are sort of framed as the protagonists, but they really don't have a huge amount of kind of character work, or they never really kind of feel like they're that particularly well developed. And the movie wants to spend more time looking at these the vampire going on dates, and then the werewolf woman kind of going on dates, and then talking about it afterwards. So there's not really a huge amount of action or plot in this film. I kind of quite like the werewolf, the way it's sort of staged in the practical suit, and how our characters are dealt with in their human form, and how she kind of interacts with her cousin. The vampire, I think, is less successful. Weirdly, obviously, you need less work with a vampire than you do with a werewolf in regards to setting up that kind of practical supernatural imagery. But I've got to say, it's a little cheesy on the vampire side. It's kind of like this Euro trash style, Anne Rice kind of romantic sort of style vampire. It's particularly kind of cheesy, one would say, and I think it ends up being a little on the hammy side. Also, it has this, as I say, this moral quandary where the movie doesn't really want to have any party particularly kind of painted as a antagonist or a protagonist, but both the werewolf and the vampires both kill people. And we learn of a lot of other victims that have happened through this vampire hunting group. And it almost tries to justify the fact that these characters are killing people because they're a-holes of one description and of another. And that sort of justifies it. But I think, well, surely murder and the moral scale of things is probably worse than this guy was cheating on his wife or something like that. I don't know. The movie has this sort of a little bit of a warped sense of morality, especially when it's trying to, discuss about morality. Like, so this guy was, he was a bit sort of a toxic, so therefore he deserved to die, but he's toxic, so yes, he's a bad date. But then the movie says in that case it's okay to kill him and things like that. And the vampire is even more morally kind of like questionable, I have to say, because there's the second date that he goes on. I thought this woman seemed no problem whatsoever, apart from she smashed one of his glasses by accident, so there's certainly some sort of, this movie tries to have this cake and eat it, but I don't think it quite succeeds on the kind of the scales of morality here. The world that this kind of movie exists in, I don't think is particularly sort of well established, because the vampire hunting crew clearly know about vampires, but it's unclear if they really know about werewolves until right at the end, and it's not really clear if werewolves know about vampires or vampires know about werewolves until the very, very end, where all of these kind of characters kind of meet up. And it's so the kind of the rules of this of this world aren't particularly kind of well established, and even like its weaknesses and stuff. Again, the movie's real focus here is on the kind of the actual sort of dating sort of side of things, and that's kind of it. It doesn't really flesh out much else, to be honest. The movie doesn't have a lot of action in it. We get one real fight at the end. It's lacking in kind of gore. We get some kind of very hammy sort of CGI blood that kind of spurts out. It's not ever really a horror movie that is going to scare you. It's more of, as they say, a goth supernatural dating movie more than anything else. The acting, with a few exceptions that I've mentioned, is on the weaker side. Part of that, I think, is because the characterization isn't particularly strong, but yeah, there's also some kind of hammy acting here. So it's kind of a bit of a kind of missed opportunity, but it does have some interesting ideas, I would say. Really only for B-movie fans. Certainly, I think the idea of a supernatural movie based on dating is interesting, and it did have a few elements that I kind of enjoyed, but there were a lot of missed opportunities here. I'm going to give this a 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? Please do let me know your thoughts, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.